Hello, my name is Sam Illingworth. I'm an associate professor at Edinburgh Napier University in the UK. And in this short presentation, I'm going to talk to you about talking about decarbonisation through games. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about tabletop games, so games that we play on the table, board games, card games, etc. And if you've got any questions, please contact me either via my website or through Twitter, and I'd be really happy to take any questions that you might have. So, first of all, why tabletop games? Well, tabletop games, when we sit down and play games with another person, we basically create an environment in which dialogue can take place. And the reason for this is that we, as I put in this quote here, it creates a safe space, but we also negotiate contracts with the fellow players. So what that means is that we can, to some extent, forget our relationships away from the table and establish new ones and enable new dialogues to take place at the table. So, for example, if we're playing Monopoly, which many of you will be familiar with, it's perfectly acceptable or encourageable for me to try and bankrupt you at the gaming table, whereas away from the gaming table, that's a behavior that's morally repugnant. So by playing a game together, we're negotiating our own contracts, and in negotiating those contracts, we create a space in which dialogue can take place. So games are a really powerful place through which dialogue around difficult and contentious topics such as decarbonisation and fuel poverty can occur. And my colleague Paul Wake from Manchester Metropolitan University and myself have developed several games that look at environmental change and climate change. On the right here, you can see an expansion that we created for the popular tabletop game Catan. You can read more about that in the paper reference that I've got here. And on the left is just a bit of a silly rubbish game called Climate Change Bingo. And the idea really of these games is to show that when you design games and when you create games, you can create them to teach people about ideas and to hopefully elicit conversations at the tabletop. But one of the most powerful ways to actually start developing dialogue and starting having conversations is to co-create games, because then those conversations take place during the creation phase as well as during the playing phase. And during the creation phase, as a games designer and as a researcher, you're there throughout that entire process. So you can really help to ensure that such dialogue takes place. So in 2019, Paul and I were invited by the climate charity Possible to create a card game called Carbon City Zero. So the idea of this game was really, we want to create a card game that people would use in order to have dialogues around what it meant to be a zero carbon city. And in creating this game, we worked with many different communities. So we worked with activists, students, policymakers, teachers, community members, industry experts, hundreds of people to get what their opinions and thoughts around what it meant to be a carbon zero city, what the challenges were of decarbonisation in different environments. And after getting all of these ideas and all these thoughts processes, we started to create a game and the basic structure for a game. And in this game, you basically play a city mayor, and you're trying to create the world's first zero carbon city, and you're competing against your fellow players in order to do so. But because we were co-creating this game rather than just designing it, what it meant was that we could listen to the voices of all the people that were involved in these dialogues, including those audiences that might normally be underserved or underheard, which meant that their thoughts, their processes, their ideas got to the gaming table. We also, in the co-design process, involved professional artists and graphic designers, in this case, the artist Tony Pickering and the designer Matt Bonner. And you can see that this really helped the design development process. So on the far left, we have the initial prototype card, and on the far right, we have a card that had been gone through a graphic design and professional artist stage. The card in the middle here is basically the furthest that we got, Paul and I, with our unlimited design skills, which is why it's really essential to work with other people in order to bring the game to life and really to help make the game look better so that it can conjure up better images and help people to have those dialogues more appropriately. Also, the image on the right was developed in conjunction with an accessibility expert, so that the game, for example, took into account issues such as colour blindness, etc., so that that could be taken into account to make the game more accessible and more diverse for a wider public. And this game we created this game and people enjoyed playing it, and we ended up launching it on Kickstarter. It made over £10,000 and sent to several hundred people, which was great. But because it was a co-created game, we wanted to get feedback from people. What did people think? And people really enjoyed the game generally, but they had a really useful comment. And the comment was, why are you competing against each other? Like, why is this a competitive game? Shouldn't it be a collaborative game where we're trying to, as a team, create a city that is carbon neutral rather than one city against another city? And Paul and I didn't really have a good response to that because it was an excellent question. So our response was just to go and design another version of the game. And we designed a second edition, really, called Carbon City Zero World Edition, in which players collaboratively work together to try and reduce the carbon of a single city down to zero. And again, we launched this on Kickstarter. It performed even better this time, making just over £20,000. And that's just been sent out to backers all across the world. So this was a really useful step for us because it was about the importance of listening to feedback. And with the co-creation process and indeed just talking to people generally, it's a really useful lesson. We shouldn't just talk to a wider variety of people about decarbonisation and fuel poverty because it's a box ticking exercise. We should talk to them because they will come up with solutions that we couldn't possibly think of. And listening to that feedback and listening to that advice can really help us to improve our own research and our own output, whatever that might be. So in creating this game, in developing this game, we were able to listen to many hundreds of people, what their thoughts, what their processes, what their understanding of decarbonisation was. And we could use this to help shape the game, to help reflect the game, and then to help start conversations during the creation and the play testing of that game as well. So as well as listening to people's thoughts, we also went to go and play test it with many hundred people just to make sure the mechanics were right, that it was well represented, and that gave further voice. So there was a huge input of people into the co-design of this game. And now we're at the really exciting point where it's looking at the actual conversations that the game's starting to elicit. So we know that the game was starting to have conversations, and many conversations in the design process, but when people take it to the table themselves now, what kind of conversations are people having? And this is a really interesting post that I've just pulled from Facebook from an anonymized person who said that they were a town councillor who backed the game, and they're really looking forward to getting it to the table to play with their fellow town councillors, which is really exciting for us. You can actually play the game for free. So you can play it in a virtual space on a website called Tabletopia, or you can download it from a website called P&P Arcade, which just stands for Print and Play. Just Google either of those terms, and Carbon City Zero. So Carbon City Zero World Edition is the more updated version. It's got rules for competitive and collaborative play as well. And I'd really love you to download these games and let me know what you think about them. To what extent are they starting conversations, and how are they helping to move forward dialogues surrounding decarbonisation? So that's the end of my short presentation about using games to talk about decarbonisation. I hope it's been useful. If you've got any questions, please connect with me via my website or via Twitter. And please do download the games, give them a play, let me know what you think. And if you're interested yourself in maybe thinking about turning your research around decarbonisation or fuel poverty into a board game, into a card game, please get in contact, as Paul and I would really like to work with you in that process. Got a lot of experience in doing so. And hopefully this presentation has demonstrated that that can be a really collaborative and productive process. Thanks very much for listening.